So I've done a lot of the full production type videos lately, so I think it's time to do just a simple on-camera video like this. And I'm getting over a bit of a cold, but that's not going to stop me from doing a video. Topic for today: did the Crusades violate Christian teaching? This was not a common idea in the medieval era. So like during the era of the Crusades, it was pretty much universally agreed that this was a good thing to be doing, that this was a righteous cause. But this is something that you hear a lot nowadays. You do hear people saying this. YouTube comments, just popular chatter, you will get this. And I think it's based on two important misunderstandings. I think it's based on a misunderstanding of Christianity itself and also on the Crusades and the history of the Crusades. A lot of people will talk a lot about the Crusades without really knowing much about what they were about, what was going on. So let's get into some of this. So first of all, I just want to point out that Christianity is not a pacifist religion. It is not now. It has never been. It was not founded as a pacifist religion by Jesus. And this is pretty clear when you look into the Gospels. I mean, when you take the Bible as a whole, people will have this idea that Christianity is about, live and let live. Don't judge anybody. Be nice to people. Don't say anything that would offend somebody. Jesus would never judge somebody for having a different religious point of view. This is almost the idea you get from people. Look at Jesus in the Gospels, what he was doing. He was founding a religion, he was founding a movement that he himself predicted would bring conflict to the world. He said, I come not to bring peace, but a sword. And of course, what he was talking about there, he's not necessarily talking about he's literally going to lead an army. His very coming and setting up this new religion is going to create conflict between people. He even says, a conflict within families. And that Christians, they are to face that and deal with that. It might even be in a military situation. In some instances, it might be more metaphorical, but this is something that Christians are going to have to face, and that they're not supposed to just necessarily back down from conflict. There is an instance in the Gospels where Jesus himself uses force. He uses violence, and that, of course, is the famous example in the temple in Jerusalem. There are men who have come in and they have set up places to sell things, money changers. Jesus is very offended by this because they have violated this sacred space. He picks up a whip and drives these people out of the temple in Jerusalem, using violence. Again, I'm emphasizing this because in a way, this reflects what would be the mission of the Crusades. The Crusades, the first Crusade is launched. It's about going to Jerusalem and driving evildoers from Jerusalem because they are violating the sacred space of the Holy Sepulchre. This is the way it was viewed by medieval Latin Christians. They viewed this as they were purifying these holy places of evildoers. So similar to what Jesus was doing here. It's interesting that this is the example of Jesus himself using violence. And this kind of thing was very powerful for medieval Christians when they were, looking to their faith for inspiration for their own activities and their own actions. The Gospel of Luke famously affirms the power of the Roman state, or doesn't condemn it, presents it as though a Christian does not have to be in rebellion against the Roman secular authorities to be a Christian. So there's this, from the beginning, there's this idea that state power, secular non-religious power can have legitimacy. And this has an impact on Christian history. Throughout Christian history, we have these two forces. We have, secular authority like the king, and then we have the church, the religious authority, and they exist side by side. Ideally, they're supposed to exist in harmony. But this goes back to the Gospels and the fact that this message is there, that this is appropriate. It's different than other religions, like, say, for example, Islam, where the state authority and the religious authority are joined together. And of course, state power implies the use of force. So, if state power exists, then that necessitates the reality that physical force is being used. Jesus did not denounce the profession of the soldier. He praises the faith of the Roman centurion. He heals his servant. He does not tell him to give up his profession. We have something similar with John the Baptist. He's asked by some soldiers, well, what should we do? He doesn't tell them, lay down your arms, give up your profession, because, we're pacifists. He says, be content with your pay and don't commit injustices against the common people. So he does not denounce the profession of the soldier, the profession of the warrior. He simply tells them not to be exploitative. And again, this will have an impact on Christian teaching about the state. The idea is that legitimate state authority is not exploitative. If we're going to talk about the Crusades, I also think it's important that we look at the Old Testament. A lot of people don't realize how intensely biblical medieval Christianity was. People have this idea that Christians didn't know anything about the Bible until the Reformation. This is absolute nonsense. Ordinary Christians had a very deep sense of the Bible and the stories in the Bible. Although a lot of people were not literate in the Middle Ages, the Bible and the stories in it were widely known. They were known through the artwork in the churches. They were known through dramatizations that were put on in medieval villages. This was a common form of entertainment, of festivity, is that the locals in a community would put on some sort of play, some sort of drama, and oftentimes stories from the Bible were an obvious choice for this, and this was a favorite topic for these plays. So people knew what was in the Bible, and they had a deep sense of it. And medieval Western Christians identified deeply with these Old Testament stories of God leading the Israelites into battle against evildoers. So they saw themselves as God's chosen people. In fact, oftentimes, you look at these medieval chronicles of the Crusades and they describe their enemies as the Gentiles. We think of Gentiles as being people who aren't part of the Jewish community nowadays, but for medieval Christians, the term Gentile would have been used for their Saracen opponents, for whoever they were fighting in the Crusades. They really, these stories of like Joshua and these various leaders from the Old Testament, this resonated very deeply with, medieval Latin Christians. They, viewed their own holy war as, going into battle against God's enemies. They equated this with these great Old Testament epics. If you look at a lot of medieval chronicles, the language used, often these writers like Fulcher of Chartres, or the anonymous author of the Gesta Francorum, will use images and quotes directly from these Old Testament stories, this Old Testament imagery, as they're describing these Crusader campaigns. So if we move beyond the Bible and just look in early church history or early Christian history, from early on, the church fathers were articulating the idea of the role of a ruler in regards to the use of violence. Augustine came up with this idea of just war, based in part on old pagan Roman ideas and also on biblical ideas. This idea that a ruler has a duty to use force, and in fact, part of Augustine's teaching was that the only way that force could be used legitimately in this way was if it was done by the proper authorities. So the legitimate secular authority, the king, the ruler. And it had to be used for good. So a ruler had to use force for a just cause, like, say, the unjust occupation of a territory, or violence done against the innocent. This sort of thing was cause, for just warfare. Of course, a ruler who just wants to conquer some territory because he's greedy, just because he wants to rule this area, that is not justified according to, this early Christian idea of just war. For the Crusades, the Latin Christians who were engaged in the Crusades, they very much understood these wars to be just. For them, this was almost an issue of self-defense. I understand people can analyze this and quibble with this, how they view it today, but we do have to take into account the way medieval Latin Christians were viewing these particular campaigns that they were engaged in. They understood the Holy Land to have been Christian. It was Christian, under the Christian Roman emperors. It was conquered by the Muslims. And so for them, this was territory that had been Christian, that was occupied, and in particular because this was territory where Christ had lived, where he had died, he'd made his sacrifice. It was holy ground. That was even more cause for them to go in and take control of these regions. And on top of that, pilgrims who were traveling to the Holy Land, they were experiencing violence. They were experiencing attacks. sometimes by the rulers, sometimes just by, highway robbers, whatever, along the way. And so for medieval Latin Christians, they felt that this in itself was also a just cause. If you look at like Pope Urban II and his speech at before the First Crusade, he specifically talks about the plight of Eastern Christians. They are suffering. He calls them your Eastern brethren. He says that, for Western Christian knights, they have a duty, in fact, to go to the aid of their brethren in the East, to do this, for the sake of their fellow Christians. Now, of course, the motivation for various crusaders, this is a whole other topic. We could go into it. There were many motivations for going on crusade. Certainly spiritual motivations were a huge factor for a lot of people. This motivation to help your fellow Christian, this was a motivation for people as well. There were some people who just wanted to go on an adventure. Some people who were looking to carve out territory for themselves in the East. We've got the whole thing, but that's a whole other topic. But there's just no question that the Crusades were conceived as this idea of bringing aid to the East, of looking out for Christ's patrimony in the East, bringing aid to Christ's own holy places. For medieval Western Christians, the Crusades went beyond just war. They did consider these wars to be just wars, that they were justified in doing this, but it was not just a just war, it was also a holy war. So this was war that was spiritually meritorious. And just to distinguish the two, the King of France might have just cause to go to war against the King of England, but this could never be holy war. This could never be spiritually meritorious, because these are two Christian princes fighting each other. But in the case of a crusade, like say in Spain or the Holy Land, they were fighting against a non-Christian power who was unjustly occupying Christian territory as they saw it. This was spiritually meritorious activity. You could compare it to the prayers of a monk in a monastery. This was spiritually beneficial, spiritually meritorious. They saw, again, in their own activity, they saw it reflected in the Old Testament battles of the Israelites against these wicked people as they're described in the Old Testament. And in fact, the Crusades were viewed as a sacrificial act of love. Like, if you're going off to fight this campaign where, for the vast majority of people, there's no, guarantee of any kind of financial reward. You're fighting far away from home, very expensive to do, very dangerous. A lot of people did not make it back. So the idea was this was such a dramatically difficult thing to do, such a sacrificial thing to engage in, that this was an act of love, an act of love for God, an act of love for your fellow Christians who you're helping, whether they be in Spain or the Holy Land. This was prompted by love of your fellow Christians. And also this was considered to be the duty of the warrior class. So the idea that the church was presenting to the knightly elite of this period of time was that, look, your profession means that you are obligated to engage in righteous warfare. If you're just fighting each other for personal gain, that is immoral, that is sinful. But if you turn your sword toward a good cause, toward helping Christians who are being oppressed somewhere else, toward liberating the holy places from the rule of, infidels, then this is the proper aim of your particular office, your station in life. St. Bernard of Clairvaux talked a lot about this in his writings on the Knights Templar. And in fact, in a lot of the writings about the Crusades, crusading is described as the way of the cross, so imitation of Christ himself. Christ took up his cross and died for the sins of the world, died for those he loved, mankind. A crusader took up his cross, he sewed a cross to his cloak, to his shirt, and then he went to fight against the enemies of God, to fight in the cause of his fellow Christians, to fight, for the cause of God. So I think we have to conclude that the Crusades as a movement were consistent with Christian teaching about, the proper use of violence, the proper use of force, just war, this kind of thing. Does that mean that every single crusader always acted in ways that were consistent with those principles? No, it does not. There are examples of crusading that were condemned in their own time. For example, the notorious Fourth Crusade in 1204 that was turned against Constantinople. The Pope denounced that, excommunicated those crusaders, said that they had betrayed their vow as crusaders. So, we can find all kinds of things in the history of the Crusades that might not conform to this ideal of crusading and might in fact violate tenets of Christianity. But that doesn't mean the movement itself was a violation of Christian teaching. I think we can show quite clearly that the movement, as it was conceived, as it was generally carried out, was not in violation with Christian teaching. Modern Christians, some modern Christians might disagree with medieval Christians and how they viewed this, but that really doesn't make them right about Christianity itself. These modern ideas about Christianity as being pacifist, I think this springs from more modern movements. Humanism, the Enlightenment, universalist ideas, post 18th century type thinking. This has come to shape the way a lot of people view Christianity today, but that doesn't change what Christianity was at its inception and how it was viewed for centuries. So I think once you've refuted the idea that Christianity was a pacifist religion, you might say, okay, well, then the cause of the Crusades were not just. I personally don't think that this was a just cause. Okay, you can argue that, but you do have to understand that for medieval Christians, they viewed these as just wars. They considered the cause just, and you do have to look at their reasons for why they considered this to be justified. You have to take that seriously, and I think we've gone over that pretty thoroughly already, so I'll just leave it at that. So I hope you guys enjoyed this topic. I do think it's a very interesting discussion. Let me know what you think in the comments, and I'll talk to you guys soon.